Hello everyone, welcome to the extended edition of the Minimalist Jool-5. I started planning this all the way back in December of 2024, getting everything designed and put together, and making sure that my margins were all calculated, which was a process in and of itself, and then promptly started working on other things, and didn't end up flying the mission until June of 2025, and it took an entire month or more just to fly the mission, and then it took over a month to actually edit it down into a video. So this has been a very, very long process for sure. It's been over 150 hours. By the time this will be out, it'll be another, I don't know how long it's going to take to edit this together, but it's been a lot of effort, and I'm really happy with what I've managed to put together here.
The Jool-5 challenge, I think, is really one of the most quintessential challenges in Kerbal Space Program. It covers a lot of the very different aspects of mission planning that might be interesting to somebody. Tylo, for example, has no atmosphere but a very high gravity, so you have to be careful with your landings, and Laythe has an atmosphere as opposed to that, so you can take advantage of that to make a different kind of lander, but it also makes it more expensive. Vall is more moderate, similar to the Mun, and it provides an easier challenge compared to the other two. And Bop and Pull are very far away from everything else in the system, while also being very small, so it's more of an orbital mechanics problem. With all of these different challenges, it usually necessitates a very large and able-bodied craft, if you will, in order to complete the challenge. However, I've managed to design a craft that is less than 4 tons that can complete the entirety of it. So without any further ado, let's get on with the mission. The jet-propelled portion of this ascent is done by the afterburner Panther engine. This is an improvement over the Whiplash engine of 0.6 of a ton, and was made possible thanks to how much lighter all of the landers have become since Proxima's previous 5.2-ton record. It has a lower top speed than the Whiplash engine, only being able to reach a maximum of around 950 meters per second, but the extra fuel that you need in the Spark engine stage is worth the decrease in mass that the Panther engine provides. Finding an optimal ascent trajectory was the most crucial part to this ascent, since if I can find the trajectory that I can take that reduces the amount of fuel that I need to use, I can reduce the amount of fuel that are in the tanks and then have a lower launch mass. The ascent profile I'd picked here was pretty good. I pitched up to 30 degrees immediately off of takeoff and then held that until my apoapsis was above 70 kilometers. As you saw just a minute ago, I detached the Panther engine using the engine plate. The engine plate was useful for eliminating the drag of the Panther engine along with the fuel tank that I used for it, which was a Mark 0 fuel tank. I could have probably also used the engine plate to delete the drag from the fairing, but the fairing is also the root part of the craft, meaning that the shape of it doesn't actually affect its surface area. And I had occluded all of the nodes on the inside of it anyway, so the amount of drag it was generating was minuscule. I'll take now as an opportunity to talk about the shape of the fairing. This was a point of contention for me, as it has been for other fairings in the past, where it was very difficult to get everything occluded while also minimizing the mass of the fairing itself, hence why it has this very odd look to it. The fairing ended up actually being the namesake for this craft as the amalgam, since I couldn't think of a species or anything that it resembled, and just went with some mythical figure. By this point, I've pushed my apoapsis up to just shy of 70 kilometers. I didn't push it all the way to 70 because I wanted to have more fuel left in the spark stage for when I pop the fairing. This is because the fairing does make up a significant portion of the mass of this stage, and getting rid of it netted me around 50 extra meters per second of delta V from the spark stage. This is critical because the ion engine doesn't actually produce enough thrust to get to orbit from just any trajectory, and I needed to make sure that my apoapsis was far enough away that I would have enough time to make it into a full orbit. Another thing done here to save on fuel was I positioned the command chair so that when Biliana got out of it, she was able to grab onto the ladder without using her EVA pack. This was important because she could carry the EVA pack and the cylinders with her to nullify their mass while being on the ladder. This reduced the mass of the craft by around 120 kilograms, and thus gave me a little bit of extra margin to play around with. This is also more important during the ion portion of the ascent, as the thrust is so low that any decrease in the mass of the craft is extremely helpful. With Biliana now safely in orbit of Kerbin, it's time to start planning the ejection to the Mun. The first thing I did was wait for the periapsis to be under direct sunlight. This made recharging the batteries between burns much simpler, since I could just point in one direction and the solar panel would always be pointed up at the sun. The second thing I did was remove the large solar panels that I used during the circularization. These were just to extend the fully powered portion of the ion burn and will be no further use at Jool. Now that the ejection to the Mun is underway, I'd like to talk about how I planned the orbital mechanics of this mission. Generally, I only have to consider how much delta V I need for all of the transfers, corrections, and captures and such, but this mission in particular requires a more nuanced approach. Because landers are being expended throughout the mission, the mass of the craft I need to transfer is always changing, meaning that I should account for this when deciding how much xenon I should bring. If I just assume that it's always in its heaviest state, then I'm vastly over budgeting how much xenon I need, and by the end of the mission, I will have found out that I could have saved many, many kilograms of mass. Thankfully, I'm an accounting major, so this is right up my alley. As you can see here, all of my budgeting was done in a big spreadsheet. I won't get into all the formulas, but it boiled down to solving for the final mass in the rocket equation and then iterating it from there. My philosophy here was to find out how much delta V I would be using each time I use the ion engine, and calculate the xenon I would be using given the mass of the craft at the time. While I consider my work here to be of high quality, I still wasn't exactly sure how much I could trust my numbers, so I tried to be conservative with my expenditures throughout the mission. Maybe for some elevated drama, we could say that I didn't know if the mission was going to finish or not. But, if I'm being honest, I did know that I would have a pretty decent margin by the end of things. By now, Biliana has built up enough velocity that she can intercept the Mun. Using the Mun can save around 250 meters per second of delta V on the ejection to Eve. However, the Mun on its own isn't strong enough to get to Eve with a single slingshot out of orbit of Kerbin. Here, I used 2 assists off the Mun to eject from Kerbin, and then an additional 3 on interplanetary rendezvous to build up relative velocity. This works because encountering the Mun in the direction that you are orbiting Kerbal can help increase your velocity relative to Kerbin, so that when you come back around, you can redirect your velocity and then get to Eve from there, which is what I did here with a final assist from Kerbin to redirect the velocity I'd gained up and get an encounter with Eve. From there, an Eve assist along with 2 other Kerbin assists can classically get us to Jool, like the ever-present KEKKJ route. Now at Jool, a multitude of gravity assists will bring Biliana to an efficient encounter with Laythe. Efficient here means that I will intercept with Laythe's atmosphere while going as slow as I possibly can be. My trajectory when I encountered Jool was less than optimal, so I had to find a somewhat unconventional series of assists involving multiple, as my fellow minimalist Proxima christened them, suicide assists. Ideally, I would only need 2 or 3 assists total, namely assisting off of Tylo, then Vall, then encountering Laythe, or maybe adding a 3rd assist in there to help, but this is arguably more entertaining, so I won't complain too much. But I will mention that this kind of sequence is very tedious to set up. There were many points in time where there were some kind of resonant orbits that would cause me to encounter planets that the patch conics didn't show me, and I would have to I would have to redo all the routing, so it is less than ideal, but it makes for an entertaining video. I'd also like to take this sequence as a bit of an opportunity to mention the multitude of correction burns that have been sadly removed from this mission. There were many times where I had to use multiple correction burns of very small amounts in order to fine-tune my approaches, since something would go wrong
with the physics calculations, and it would be off slightly by the time I got there. And including all of them would result in this video being well over 6 hours long, so most of them will be omitted for your viewing pleasure. After positioning a flag to shield the craft from heating, it's time to aero capture at Laythe. The optimal trajectory of the encounter allows Biliana to only skim the upper layer of the atmosphere while still managing the capture. I will have to admit to some cinematographical fraudulence here, as the fiery and exciting capture you all saw in the standard edition was actually not the capture I ended up using in the actual mission. It was used simply as a more interesting visual since the actual capture had no pyrotechnics to speak of. The benefit of having a high periapsis here is that the fuel needed to raise the periapsis after you capture above 50 kilometers is significantly lower the higher the periapsis is, and saving a few grams of xenon here is better than saving nothing. After parking in a stable orbit, Biliana now must complete the tavern puzzle-esque task of assembling the Laythe lander. As with Proxima's mission before mine, EVA construction was used extensively to avoid spending kilograms on docking ports. However, it was not possible to simply store every part needed for the mission department store style in a fairing and have everything be assembled, since certain assemblages of parts required techniques simply unavailable to Biliana and her EVA pack. This is immediately the case with the Laythe lander, as the prop blades require precision engineering and symmetry, neither of which are practical in this setting. This meant that some kilograms shamefully needed to be wasted on decouplers to segregate landers from the rest of the craft. Perhaps a future engineer could find a way to organize the craft where the whole of the craft can be mashed into a fairing without any decouplers, which would save 20 kilograms off this mission. As I was recording this voiceover, I realized that there is currently a way to remove the need for any decouplers on any of the landers. I had assumed due to some strange building techniques that I will get into later, that the Tylo lander needed to be fully assembled in the craft. After some testing, I found this to not be the case. Additionally, if I had routed the landers around the Laythe lander, I could have used EVA construction to remove all of the parts from it and reassemble them as separated from the lander. Although it is disappointing for me to know that a relatively easy mass save flew under the radar, I hope this serves as a demonstration of how much there is still to improve upon this mission. I love challenges that require outside-the-box thinking, and KSP is a great way to experience this, and although it's been frustrating at times, reverse engineering the way the game works has been a super fun experience. Of course, if no one else is doing it with me, it's hard to stay motivated to keep doing it, so I encourage everyone watching to join me in the Minimalist Missions List server linked below. This server's been around for a little while, but as far as I can remember, I haven't published it anywhere, so consider this the inaugural announcement of it, if you will. Anyways, while I've been yapping, Biliana and the Laythe lander have arrived in low Laythe orbit. Even though I had brought a flag with me, I neglected to use it as a heat shield, so instead I had to do a multitude of aerobraking passes to avoid overheating the fins. After doing a short burn to circularize in low orbit, I again used EVA construction to remove the ion tug, which renders the craft ready to undertake the Laythe landing. Some of you may remember the somewhat infamous discovery of mine, where female Kerbals are more tolerant to atmospheric heating than male Kerbals, hence why Biliana is piloting this mission as opposed to some other engineer. Unfortunately, she isn't tolerant enough to survive the entry while holding onto the lander. Biliana has more drag on her own than the craft, so she can just enter on her own, but this adds some complications in getting both her and the lander on the same spot. This took quite a long time to get, but I was eventually able to manage it by reloading saves and adjusting my trajectory while entering the atmosphere, and how fast Biliana was going versus how fast the craft was going, and some other factors to get them at least somewhat close. And I also had figured out during the landing sequence that I could somewhat control where the lander would land used by angling the craft in different directions. So it took a while, but I was eventually able to manage it. Now that we're at least technically safely on the surface of Laythe, Biliana starts the obligatory ceremonies of walking around and planting a flag. Of course, the flag can't be left on Laythe since there's only one, so it will be saved for a later destination. You'll see me moving the solar panel here, and that was simply to get it out of the way of Biliana's head. I hadn't noticed this happening on at least a few of the failed ascents, and it had caused the craft to tumble out of control. I'll use this as a segue to talking about the time investment that this mission constituted. Excluding everything else, the raw footage from this mission totals over 36 hours in length, taking up 712 gigabytes of drive space on my computer. I started recording on June 3rd of 2025 and finished on July 17th. That, on its own, would be an enormous time investment for just one KSP video, but there were many, many hours of play that wasn't recorded or was deleted. The Laythe Ascent took more than half a dozen attempts to get, and I had even forgotten to lock out the dumpling tank after making orbit, and I had to restart after flying a lot of the mission. There were also hours of maneuver node editing that I did off camera for the sake of saving drive space, since I knew I wasn't going to show the fiddling due to rapid camera movements I tend to make. If I had to estimate, the mission totaled over 60 hours to fly. Even before this, though, there were dozens of hours of testing, calculating, revising, and strategizing that I had to do to even be sure that the mission was going to work in the first place. This phase was months ago, so I can't really give a good estimate on how much time I spent on it, but a conservative guess would be around 20 hours, 4 of which, at least, was spent just on the spreadsheet that I showed earlier. After hearing all this, you would be correct to assume that I want to focus on shorter, more cinematic missions for some time, like the minimalist Minmus mission that I did. The Laythe lander utilizes an interesting quirk with propeller blades that I christened directionally unpaired momentum perpetuation, or DUMP for short. I had originally intended for the video I made on the topic to be part of this one, but ultimately decided to upload it as a standalone video. For those who haven't watched it, go watch it. I'll offer a brief summary here. Lift vectors in Kerbal Space Program are both applied based off of the direction of the fin, and also applied a frame later than intended. As a result, rotating the basic fins on the Laythe lander in a particular direction results in a feedback effect that greatly increases the efficacy of the assembly. The big ramification for Laythe is that it takes significantly less electric charge to get to the upper atmosphere. This is important because Laythe is very far from the sun, so solar power is at a premium, and that's all we have here. The part routing of this mission made it so that only the solar panel could be recycled from the propeller assembly, so reducing the number of batteries was the key benefit for this mission. In fact, this particular ascent had well over 100 units of electricity left over, so an additional 5 kilograms could be saved off of a future mission. As Biliana reaches the maximum altitude on the propeller stage, she quickly retrieves the solar panel off of the bottom stage. The whole mission utilizes sophisticated part routing to ensure that each component is used and reused as much as possible. The small solar panel is actually the only source of electrical generation after detaching the extendable panels in low Kerbin orbit, so being able to reuse the panel on Laythe saved 5 kilograms over the alternative. Now at the acme of the propeller stage, the rocket portion of the ascent can begin. The big development with Laythe was the reusability of the rocket stage. By positioning the probe core sideways, the drag is limited enough that it is relatively trivial to achieve a low Laythe orbit with all of the rocket components. This means that the spider engine, the probe core, the ladder, and the empty dumpling tank can be reused in addition to just the solar panel. Combined, this saves nearly 79 kilograms and was a big improvement in the mission. The eagle-eyed amongst you may have noticed that I had attached a flag to the rocket before staging. This was actually a mistake that I had made during the descent. I had brought the flag with me just in case, but because I had also done the same with the EVA pack, Biliana didn't have the space in her inventory for both the flag and the solar panel. The flag would make many parts of the mission much easier to execute, so it wasn't something I wanted to leave behind, but it did add about a kilogram to the mass of the rocket stage. This might not sound like a lot, but that kilogram does nominally decrease the delta V of the rocket stage. In fact, I had realized at some point before this that the fuel I had budgeted for the Tylo lander might not actually be enough, so I wanted to have some leftover fuel in low Laythe orbit to transfer. Thankfully, the EVA pack had more than enough to make up the difference, though pushing such a small craft did provide some difficulties. Once low Laythe orbit has been achieved, Biliana rendezvoused with the ion tug and brought it to the Laythe lander. Nothing about this was out of the ordinary, so I'll quickly fast forward through it. Part of why I'm making this video, though, is a more extensive proof of the mission.
Whenever I condense these missions into videos, I spend a lot of time cutting out segments that I think would detract from the overall watchability of the video to make it more entertaining. But in the process, the video loses some of its integrity. I don't know if anyone thinks that I fake my videos, but I want to make a habit of providing proof whenever possible. Cheating in Kerbal Space Program isn't really a simple topic, since it's a sandbox game, and there's no wrong way to play the game. But, as Bradley Wiston's put it, if I advertise my mission as something that it's not, it would be cheating and dishonest. My missions hold to the rules of the minimalist missions list, which I and others have edited over time to maximize competition while also allowing for interesting techniques. You can take the time to read it in the link in the description if you wish, but the point is I want to make it abundantly clear that I'm actually playing the game within these rules. Anyways, with Laythe crossed off our list, Biliana sets course for Vall. Vall has been a very interesting challenge over the years. Despite being perhaps the most forgotten about moon of the Jool system, Vall actually has a lot to talk about in terms of minimizing a lander. For the longest time, the general consensus was that using an ion engine and batteries was the best option. This started all the way back with Bradley Wiston's almost reusable Grand Tour, where 2 ion engines and a large battery bank was used to do the landing. Reusing the entirety of the lander contributed a lot to the mass of the craft, so naturally we saw a drastic reduction in the mass of the lander when Brad returned in his 6-ton Jool-5 mission. By staging the batteries midway through the ascent, he was able to bring a lot less fuel with him to the surface, as well as eliminate one of the ion engines. However, after EVA construction was added to the game, the mass of docking ports could be removed from the lander as well. In ZG Alpaca's 5.8-ton Jool-5, he used EVA construction to stage off some of the batteries mid-ascent, again allowing for less electric charge to be used. This remained the lightest Vall lander until myself and other minimalists started thinking about alternative methods of the landing. With Magic Ladder being discovered, the required number of batteries dropped significantly, but I had an idea to use the Laythe lander's rocket stage instead. With a dumpling tank, that craft can achieve over 2,000 meters per second of delta V, so it has more than enough fuel to conduct the landing despite being less than 200 kilograms. The ion engine alone is 250 kilograms, so it seemed that we had found ourselves a new Vall lander. However, I'd also thought of using something else. I knew that an EVA pack with the extra fuel cylinders could allow for a Kerbal to achieve an orbit of Vall. The problem then was how to get the Kerbal to the surface of Vall. Using a lander would waste the engine, tank, and the probe core since it wouldn't be returning to orbit, so that was an unattractive idea. Thankfully, I remembered something that I had seen in some of the Mooner speedruns of the game, and it would turn out to be the ultimate solution to the Vall problem. For some strange reason, if a Kerbal is holding on to a ladder when the craft crashes into the ground, the Kerbal's momentum will be killed instantaneously. The only challenge was making sure that the dumpling tank collided with the ground while Biliana didn't, which was made easier by offsetting the ladder far away from the dumpling tank. Because the tank and the ladder were both reused from the Laythe lander, and the EVA pack and cylinders were going to be used for other parts of the mission anyway, the mass of the Vall lander is actually 0 kilograms. For additional style points, I selected the needle-nosed mountain on Vall's equator. Of course, crashing into the mountain precisely at its peak is almost impossible, so I just aimed for anywhere on the mountain that I could hit. Of course, this then required Biliana to climb up the treacherous slope, but Kerbals are nothing if not resilient, so this wasn't a problem. For the ascent back to orbit, I wanted to save as much fuel as I could for the rendezvous with the ion chair. The best way to do this is always to start by accelerating horizontally. This offers 2 different benefits. One is that more of the fuel is spent in the desired direction, and then the other is that the effect of gravity is lessened due to increased centripetal acceleration. Both of these work together, so I started the ascent by using the vertical thrusters as little as possible. Although the mountain I selected offers a great starting point, I can't get Biliana too close to orbital velocity before she would collide with the ground, so I had to use the vertical thrusters to perform a short hop. I'm not entirely sure if my approach here is optimal, but by the time I had reached low Vall orbit, I had plenty of extra fuel to complete the rendezvous, so it didn't end up mattering too much.
Speaking of EVA fuel, this mission utilizes the bug where if you put the EVA pack and the cylinders into a cargo bay, it refuels them. This is definitely the most contentious trick used throughout the mission, and I tried to use it as little as possible. There were quite a few comments suggesting that since I'm okay with doing this at all, I should just use it for the rest of the mission, or disallow it entirely. This is a very valid criticism, and I will stand on the decision to allow this technique, and suggest that people try to beat the record with it. You will almost immediately find out that it is extremely tedious and mind-numbing to conduct the mission using only the EVA pack, and it might not even be lighter to begin with. You do still need landers for Laythe and Tylo, which currently have a combined mass of 553 kilograms. Pushing that amount of mass into low Kerbin orbit off of a suborbital trajectory is not possible with a Kerbal, especially with the fact that the thrust of the EVA pack is only about an eighth of that of an ion engine. Considering that after low Kerbin orbit, it only takes an additional 100 or so kilograms to cover the remaining maneuvers, which I estimated to be around 4,600 meters per second or so when planning the mission, it is well worth it to just bring more fuel. With Vall now checked off of our itinerary, I then proceeded onwards to land on Jool's minor moons of Bop and Pull. Of everything in the mission, this was the segment that I dreaded the most. Because Bop and Pull are so small and located far away from Jool, there is very little that can be done to reduce the delta V needed to capture there. Nonetheless, I still wanted to save as much fuel as possible, since estimating how much leftover fuel I'll have at the end of the mission is very tricky when the mass of the craft is always changing. The only option I had here was to assist off of Bop and Pull themselves, which was very tedious. Starting with Pull, the plan for the assists consisted of two steps. First, I needed to get my apoapsis as high as possible using only Pull. After this, I performed deep space maneuvers to lower my relative velocity to Pull in between assists, slowly lowering my apoapsis while maintaining my periapsis. For those unfamiliar, this technique is the same that the Messenger space probe used to get a close encounter with Mercury, and are technically known as V-infinite leveraging maneuvers. The reason I wanted to raise my apoapsis as high as I could was because, as a rule of thumb, if you're moving slower, it takes less fuel to adjust your velocity, and you're always moving your slowest at apoapsis. The standard procedure for the messenger assist is to raise your periapsis to be tangent with the body you want to capture at, and then assist off of it, which would lower your apoapsis as well as your periapsis. Then you repeat the process by raising your periapsis again, and so on. My big issue for this mission was I hadn't minimized my relative velocity to pull off of the Tylo assist, so I had to do nearly 24 assists to eliminate all of it. This was one of the longest segments of the entire mission, with the raw footage for just the journey from Vall to Pull being nearly 6 hours long, and that's even with some of the maneuver planning being off camera to save some drive space. Although I am fairly proficient at orbital mechanics, I can't say that long assist chains are very fun to plan and execute, so this was definitely my least favorite part of the entire mission. After 23 assists off of Pull, our relative velocity is now low enough that it is no longer helpful to do any more assists, so we're just going to capture. The way that we know that this is the case is by adding the future capture burn to the deep space maneuver, and if that's higher than just capturing on the next encounter, we know that it's more efficient to just capture. I had originally budgeted around 54 meters per second to be spent to get captured at Pull after ejecting from Vall, but here it ended up taking 70. This was much less than I was expecting after spending as much time as I had on the Pull assists, so I was content with that amount of loss. I did want to make up for that lost fuel though, so I decided to detach the command chair before circularizing my orbit. Looking back, this saved around 12 meters per second total across the circularization and the ejection back to elliptical Pull orbit, which likely ended up being a net zero save since I had to rendezvous with the chair. I was actually pretty surprised to learn this since it's kind of hard to judge these things during the mission, but it makes sense given that orbital burns at Pull are generally pretty small. The landing at Pull was relatively trivial compared to the others in this mission, but as with everything else, I wanted to conserve fuel in any way that I could. Unlike Vall, the optimal choice for landing on Pull has not changed, as the ion engine provides more than enough thrust to overcome gravity. This mission improves the lander in two different ways. The first is the usage of Magic Ladder, the second is more utilization of lithobraking. Magic Ladder was discovered by Ultimate Steve back in November of 2023. Whenever a Kerbal is on a ladder, their inertia is not transferred through the ladder to the craft, which means that they are effectively massless.
This is the cause of the original Kraken drive of climbing into a part of a craft to induce acceleration. Ultimate Steve had originally discovered this by attempting to control a Tylo Ascent module by moving a craft up and down on a ladder. But when no torque was induced, he realized that we had just found the best way to reduce the mass of a lander, by deleting the mass of the Kerbal entirely. As for lithobraking, I used a flag to cushion the craft from the impact. Whether a craft is destroyed by an impact or not still has some investigation to be done. But one observation I have made is that parts appear to not explode if, on the frame the collision check is made, the part is not more than a certain percentage below the ground. It also appears to vary from part to part, but for flags it seems to be around 50%. I've seen even the smallest flag survive an 80 meter per second impact before, but in this case I decided to play it safe and only impact the ground at 30 meters per second. On this particular attempt, Biliana was flung off of the craft. This had also happened during my old minimalist Elu mission, where I decided to call this a yard sail instead of fly the landing again. But the velocity was low enough at this point that it didn't really matter that this happened, but it did mean that Biliana was going to have to do some extra cardio to get back to the craft. Anyway, once Biliana had been reunited with the craft, she throws down a flag and waits for the batteries to recharge before taking off again. Ascents on low-gravity bodies are generally pretty uneventful. Even with the ion engine, Pole's gravity is so low that we can kind of just point the craft in a direction we want to go in and fire away. Admittedly, I didn't work very hard to land at an optimal location, so I did have to coast up to apoapsis first before circularizing. If I had landed on top of a mountain, I could have just burned horizontally, but with the orbital velocity being as low as it is, it didn't matter to me that much. Because I left the chair in elliptical pole orbit, charging the batteries was a bit more complicated than normal. Because you can't time warp when Kerbals are on a ladder, I had to have Biliana let go before time warping. Despite the gravity being pretty weak, it was still enough to pull her a non-significant distance from the craft. Remedying this wasn't too big of an issue, but it was annoying enough that I thought I'd mention it. Thankfully, I only had to do 2 periapsis kicks to get my orbit close to the chairs. From here, it was a bit of a wait before Biliana snags the chair and attaches it to the craft. I had to rearrange the parts a little bit, but once that's done, we are off to our next destination of Bop. The most notable challenge with Bop is simply getting to it in the first place. Bop is placed on an eccentric and highly inclined orbit. Plane changes are always extremely costly, so I elected to use gravity assists to mitigate this. Instead of ejecting to Tylo for a plane change like a normal person, I had to spend so much time doing the pull assists earlier that it was the only way I knew how to play the game anymore, apparently. So that's what I did here. It wasn't really that awful, but I might have been able to save some time with just a Tylo assist. I started doing a few assists off of pull to save some fuel on the ejection, just as I had for the capture, before using bop assists to correct my inclination. Normally, I have to tune my trajectory very precisely in order to get a desired orbit afterwards, but because I was only adjusting the inclination, I could put the periapsis as close to the surface as I dared, and I think this time I just about outdid myself. Upon review of my encounter, I attempted to use slow motion physics warp to see just how close I had gotten to the surface, but it collided with the surface even though it hadn't with 1x speed. This was because the craft had more opportunities to impact the surface, and I had gotten it so close that my trajectory actually passed through the surface. But at the speed I was going at, there wasn't any frames where I was actually clipping into the ground, so I was left unscathed. I think since I did survive at 1x speed that this doesn't qualify as clipping through the ground, but it goes to show just how close I got here. The assists at Bop also offered a very unique challenge that I really never have seen in this game before. Bop has an extremely rugged surface, with mountains reaching over 22 kilometers tall, which are the highest out of any body in the game despite it being so small. Because my goal here was to get my periapsis as near to the surface as possible, I had to tune my trajectory to go in between the northern mountains. Bop is tidally locked, so I was actually able to do this pretty effectively by working on the maneuver node when Bop is in the position in its orbit that I would have encountered it at in the future. I've never had to do anything quite like this when it comes to gravity assists before, so it was a very fun and unique challenge compared to the slog that the pull assists offered. Makes me wonder about a potential planet pack where a moon that could be used to capture around another planet could have really tall but isolated mountains that you have to route in between. With my relative velocity now lowered to a more reasonable amount, I went ahead and executed the capture burn. Thanks to the aforementioned misshapenness of BOP, I was able to put my periapsis far lower than would be recommended for a stable orbit, but it did let me shave off some fuel from the capture thanks to the O-berth effect. I don't know how much this saved, or even if it saved anything after having to circularize, but it felt cool to do so, so obviously that made it the best decision to make. I didn't want to deal with the complications of leaving the command chair in elliptical orbit again, so for the BOP landing I decided to bring it with me to the surface. However, I had engineered the lander around not having the chair. On Pole this wouldn't have mattered, but BOP is actually slightly larger than Pole, and as a result the chair is too massive to make the landing practical with the allotted batteries. This offered a rare opportunity to use EVA construction as Magic Hand to reduce the mass of the chair while also using Magic Ladder. This form of Magic Hand is significantly more difficult than the standard version, especially since it prevents you from controlling the craft, but it does allow you to delete the mass of much larger parts. I used this back in my Minimalist Elu mission to reduce the mass of the large batteries during both the landing and the ascent back to orbit. Once again, I utilized lithobraking for the landing. My plan was to slowly slide to a stop, but after bouncing for a few minutes, I started to slide downhill and needed to spend some more fuel. This definitely wasn't the most well-executed landing, but by this point I had realized that I would have plenty of extra fuel for the rest of the mission, so I wasn't too worried about it. After once again throwing down a flag and giving the batteries some time to recharge, Biliana conducts the second low-gravity ascent of this mission. Unlike on Pole, I had given some mind to landing at a high point so that I could simply point forwards and burn to orbit. This was especially useful given the impairment of magic handing the command chair. If I didn't do this, the craft wouldn't have enough electric charge to make orbit. I also had to carry a battery in Biliana's inventory to make this work, so there was actually quite a bit of part juggling to make up for the somewhat trivial ascent. The orbital maneuvers to return to the mothership at Vall from BOP was probably the hardest sequence in the entire mission. I spent upwards of 4 hours off camera just getting the route picked out from the ejection, only for every single step of the way getting to Vall requiring some kind of rerouting to get it to work. I rarely ever do missions to BOP, so I don't have much experience getting back from it. It's something I should probably spend some time practicing in the future, though doing so is pretty monotonous, so I likely won't be getting much better at it anytime soon. The capture at Vall also provided me with a challenge I'm not very good at in the form of lining up my periapsis with the motherships. I couldn't find a trajectory coming in from the previous assist that would let me capture with the right argument, so I instead tried capturing, ejecting, and recapturing with a different angle. This worked somewhat well, but it definitely wasn't the most efficient way to do it. After rendezvousing with the mothership, I was finally informed of just how much extra xenon fuel I had. I had 152 xenon left over in the Pole BOP lander when I arrived at the mothership, and the mothership had an entire, completely full xenon tank attached to it. This was far and beyond any requirement left in the mission, and it opens the door to potential future optimizations. The small xenon tank has a mass of 54 kilograms, so if it could be removed, it would be a major reduction in mass to the mission. In addition to the 25 kilograms that could be saved from removing the decouplers and battery that I mentioned earlier, these savings combined might be enough to make the orbital maneuvers possible with the reduced fuel numbers. So hopefully some other Kerbinauts watching this will take up the challenge and beat this record sometime soon. Thanks to my newfound surplus of fuel, I was able to pick whatever transfer to Tylo that I wanted. I still needed to put some effort into minimizing my burn times due to the battery limitations, but from here on out, my orbital maneuvers were much easier to plan and execute. For once in one of my missions, the retro burns at Tylo didn't take all that long to do. I brought the extra batteries from the Pole BOP lander, allowing me to circularize my orbit in just 9 periapsis kicks, or about 15 minutes of real time. When I did this for the Ionid by Jeb, it took me more than triple that time, so I was happy that this went so smoothly. The last thing to do before conducting the landing was to detach the ion components and set up the Tylo lander. The design that I'm using here is heavily inspired by a design developed by Ultimate Steve. I did recreate it myself, but I lovingly borrowed, appropriated, plagiarized the fuel loadout for the landing. Really, this lander is his creation and I just used it, so I really should give credit to him for this lander. So thank you to Ultimate Steve for once again bringing a major development to the world of minimalist KSP missions.
The Tylo lander is probably the most interesting engineering challenge out of any of the Julian moons, and as such, it has seen one of the most dramatic reductions in mass over time. In the context of a Jool-5, one of the earliest low-mass missions of the modern era was conducted by the legendary Kerbin astronaut, who is most famous for being the first to prove that an Eve SSTO is possible. He used a two-stage lander consisting of a spark-powered descent stage and an ant-powered ascent stage, massing in at just over 3 tons. Back in August of 2015, just a few months after version 1.0 was released. Just over a year later, Nephrons would break Astrobon's record, bringing with it a major improvement to the Tylo lander. Nephrons would do away with the heavy reaction wheel and batteries, and cleverly use the two-stage craft that only used one spark engine and had a frontally mounted drop tank, bringing the mass down to just under 1.2 tons. I should note for these early records that the spark engine was significantly more overpowered than it is today, as it was nerfed in April of 2019. It took nearly 2.5 years for the Tylo lander to see any improvements, which came in the form of Guybrush Kerman's sub-5-ton Tylo mission. His design was similar to Nephrum's, but it used 2 drop tanks instead of just 1. This lowered the mass slightly down to 1.1 tons. Thankfully, though, it wouldn't be too much longer until we saw another improvement, and it came in the form of Bradley Wistance's legendary 6.2-ton Jool-5 mission. This mission set the benchmark for all Jool-5 missions to come from here on out, though honestly you could say this about almost all of Brad's missions. True to form, every landing in this mission was an improvement over all previous efforts, and Tylo was no different. Brad had managed to strike 200 kilograms off of Guybrush's lander, coming in at about 900 kilograms total. However, just after his video would come out, the nerf to the spark engine that I mentioned happened, and this nerf was in the form of the mass being increased by 30 kilograms. It would be over 4 years until the Tylo lander saw another improvement, and just as before, it was in another Jool-5 mission, this time flown by Proxima. While ZG Alpaca was the first to try this approach, Proxima was the first to really make the use of Ant and Spider engines work well with her Tylo lander of exactly 900 kilograms. The next improvement would come gloriously in Proxima and Ultimate Steve's 7-ton Grand Tour. Through expanding on Proxima's previous developments, they were able to cut an additional 100 kilograms off of the record. But this would be made obsolete even while they were still flying the mission with the discovery of Magic Ladder. With this, I was personally able to contribute to this history with my own Tylo record, and the lander had a mass of 521 kilograms. This remained the lightest Tylo lander used in a mission until this one. But there was a lot of discussion and experimentation going on behind the scenes. It just never amounted to a flown mission. Tylo exists at this perfect medium where it is restricted enough that it's an interesting challenge, but there are so many possible solutions that it isn't clear what the optimal choice is. There have been attempts using monopropellant, sepatrons, or just sticking with the classic approach of spider and ant engines with extreme optimization, all of which were very capable of being the one to be used in this mission. In fact, this lander design might not even be the most optimal one. So, again, I'm going to call on everybody watching this video to investigate this mission and try to improve it yourselves. The design that we ultimately settled on makes use of just one spider engine for the landing stage. The initial TWR is just barely above 1, but as the fuel drains, the TWR increases, so by the time Biliana reaches the surface, there will be an excess of thrust. Some Delta V was saved by staging off one of the 2 dumpling tanks with EVA construction once it was emptied. This was a little tricky to work with since I couldn't look at the fuel levels while piloting Biliana, so I had to count in my head and detach the tank when I hit 0. From here, though, the landing was fairly standard, though the margins were extremely tight. It took many attempts to get my trajectory just right, and even this attempt only barely managed to make it to the surface. The landing might have been chaotic, but all that really matters is that Biliana and the last few vital parts are intact on the surface of Tylo. Since this is the last landing of the mission, Biliana finally leaves the flag behind on Tylo, leaving a hopefully inspirational and not self-aggrandizing message behind. With all due pleasantries observed, it's time for Biliana to make her daring return to Tylo orbit. You might be somewhat concerned that the fuel tank was destroyed on impact, but the innovative design by Ultimate Steve uses a special technique to achieve very high velocities. If you're a fan of Strats and Blitz 75, you might be able to figure out what's going to happen here. Because the only thing that is being decoupled is a cubic strut and a ladder,
and also because the Kerbal's inertia is ignored through Magic Ladder, the mass that is being expelled is only 6 kilograms. The radial decoupler used here imparts 250 newtons of force onto the ejecta, which would net us about 420 meters per second of exit velocity. Physics warping multiplies this, and here I use 3x physics warp, so the expected exit velocity is around 1,250 meters per second. For some reason, though, Biliana was actually flung off of the ladder at over 1,700 meters per second. Looking at the frames, it appears that once I staged the ladder, it started to spin, which then flung Biliana off at a much higher velocity. I can't exactly be sure what happened here, but it looks like a stroke of dumb luck made this mission significantly easier. To be clear though, even if this didn't happen, the mission still would have been possible, just the margins on the EVA pack portion of the Ascent would have been much tighter. Thanks to the lucky extra impulse, the extra fuel cylinders that I brought ended up not being necessary. This might seem like a potential mass saving, but those cylinders are still required to reach Vall orbit, so they can't be removed just yet. I had set the angle on the decoupler as low as I could without colliding into the terrain, but it still resulted in my apoapsis being much higher than I would have liked. I took this as an opportunity to burn only horizontally at first, saving more fuel. After I crested over apoapsis and started descending, I burned radially to set my apoapsis at my desired altitude of 10 kilometers. This isn't necessarily the most efficient approach, but since I had so much extra fuel, it didn't matter all that much. At long last, the landings of all the moons of Jool have been completed, and all that is left is to return home. As I mentioned before, I have a major surplus of xenon, so the return back to Kerbin is going to be trivial. In fact, I have so much extra fuel that I could just transfer directly to Kerbin without any assists, but once again I am limited by my batteries, so I will conduct the gravity assists again. I do get to hold on to the batteries from the Pol Bop lander, so I have triple the burn times than I was anticipating, just like before. The return to Kerbin is mostly standard. I did run into some complications setting up the assist to eject from Jool, but other than that, everything was about the same. Gravity assists work in both directions, so whatever route you use to get to a particular location will work to get you back from there. One thing that I benefit from, though, is that I can use Kerbin's atmosphere to capture. I made sure that I had a flag to shield the craft by this point in the mission during the engineering phase, since it saves so much time for less than a kilogram of added mass. As a caution, though, make sure that you bring more than the 0.625 meter flag. I had tried this in my minimalist mission to Eve, only to find out that the flag isn't actually big enough to hide the Kerbal from re-entry heating, making the re-entry significantly more difficult. If you use the 1.25 meter flag or larger, you will be fine, though. Once I captured at Kerbin, I noticed that my trajectory put me somewhat close to a Minmus encounter. I had the extra batteries, and well over 2,000 meters per second of fuel, so I figured, what the hell, let's add one more landing to this mission. Really, with the surplus of fuel that I have, I could have also added Gilly to the landing count. But by this point, I had been flying the mission for well over a month, and one extra flex landing was all I was willing to tolerate. If I had added Gilly, though, this mission would have taken the record for the highest landings to mass ratio out of any mission to date. The current record is held by Proxima and Ultimate Steve's Grand Tour, with a ratio of 1.82 landings per ton of mass. Since I've worked on this video, I've updated the minimalist missions list to calculate this for all submitted missions and rank them, so you all can try to optimize a mission for this and take the record. ISRU isn't allowed for this, so you do need to think hard about what you want to include and what landings you want to conduct. But it's a fascinating challenge, and I think it should have some more attention brought to it. Anyways, the last thing left to do is to break down to a low Kerbin orbit and conduct the landing. This is pretty straightforward, so instead of talking about that, I want to give my final reflections on this mission and the project as a whole. Without a doubt, this mission is the most difficult challenge I have ever completed in this game. The extensive planning, testing, engineering, the magnitude of the piloting itself, and all the math that went into the different planning phases, everything that I had to do is unmatched by anything else that I've attempted. I'm immensely proud of everything that I've put together here, and I don't see this being topped by anything that I do anytime soon. As for the production cycle of this video, things went significantly differently than I was expecting. The production of the music video was relatively standard, though I did learn some new editing techniques along the way, such as masking, but this voiceover actually went relatively poorly. I'd originally estimated that it would only take a couple months to produce this, but instead it went on to take almost 6. To be fair to myself, part of this was because I only wanted to record when my roommate was out,
to save him the headache of listening to me stutter through making this video. Trust me, there are a lot of takes where I just horribly bumble my words. But there was also the issue of me getting distracted by making multiple other videos in the meantime. I've spent the last month solely focused on getting this finished and will soon return to making normal videos. But I want to apologize for my mistaken estimate from before. I hope that the extra time that I've taken to produce this was well worth the wait and made this project much more enjoyable. The final trick that I used was to eject Biliana from her chair just before hitting the ground, spectacularly destroying the craft while leaving only her intact. After 250 years in space, Biliana has finally completed her minimalist Jool-5 mission. I hope that this mission can serve as an inspiration for all of you watching this to take up the fascinating and rewarding experience of optimized KSP missions, as they offer so much opportunity for lateral thinking problems and puzzles, and it's just something that I'm really passionate about, and I would love to see more people take up the challenge. I hope that this commentary helps shed some light on how they're done too, so that it's less of an enigma than it used to be. After over a year of working on this Goliath of a project, I can finally say that this is only just the beginning. It's the beginning of something far grander.